There are places in every city that people stop thinking of as public space. They become extensions of home, familiar enough that caution feels unnecessary, safe enough that no one thinks to look over their shoulder. In Tacoma, Washington, that place was Point Defiance Park. It stretched across 760 acres of old-growth forest above the Puget Sound, the kind of park that smelled like pine and salt water and felt like it belonged to everyone who had ever walked its trails. Families picnicked along the waterfront. Joggers ran the 5-mile drive loop through the dense canopy. Children on bikes learned its hills by heart. For the people of Tacoma in the summer of 1986, Point Defiance was not a place to be careful. It was a place to exhale. On the morning of August 4th, 1986, a 13-year-old girl named Jennifer Bastian left her house, climbed onto her brand-new green Schwinn bicycle, and rode 30 blocks to her favorite place in the world. She left a note for her family. She promised she would be home for dinner. She did not come home. The man who made certain she didn't spend the next 32 years living quietly, working, raising a family, being exactly the kind of neighbor people describe as kind. He shoveled sidewalks. He showed up for his daughter. He gave no outward sign of what he had done in those woods on a summer afternoon when a girl on a green bicycle crossed his path. What he did not know, what no one knew in 1986, was that he had left something behind, something too small to see, too durable to destroy, and too patient to disappear. For 3 decades it sat in an evidence locker, waiting for science to become what it needed to be. It was always going to be enough. It just needed time. Jennifer Marie Bastian, Jenny to everyone who knew her, was the kind of 13-year-old who filled a room without trying. She was a strong swimmer, a dedicated cyclist, and a daughter who made her parents proud in the uncomplicated way that good kids do before the world gets complicated. The summer of 1986 was a good one. Her parents had given her a green Schwinn bicycle, and she had fallen for it immediately. The weight of it, the speed of it, the feeling of the 5-mile drive loop unspooling ahead of her through Point Defiance's dense canopy. She rode it constantly, not just for the pleasure of it, but for a specific, motivated purpose. She and her father had made a plan. A multi-day cycling tour through the San Juan Islands later that summer, just the two of them. Jenny wanted to be ready. She wanted to prove she could handle the hills, keep the pace, hold her own on the long stretches. Training at Point Defiance was how she was going to do it. Every ride was preparation. Every hill conquered was a step toward that shared goal. On the morning of August 4th, she put on her swimsuit under her clothes, left a note, and pedaled toward the park with the unhurried confidence of a girl who knew exactly where she was going and had every reason to believe she would be back before dark. Her family expected her at dinner. When the hours passed and the light started to fade and Jennifer did not appear, her father did what fathers do. He drove to the park. He ran the 5-mile drive loop over and over, stopping at every pullout, calling her name at every trailhead, scanning the roadsides for a flash of green metal in the dimming light. He found nothing. Her bike was gone too. The family called police that night. What began as a missing person report was about to become something no one in Tacoma was prepared for. The search for Jennifer Bastian became one of the largest missing person operations Tacoma had mounted. Officers and volunteers moved through Point Defiance Park in the days following her disappearance, pushing through underbrush, checking trail intersections, working the dense woods and grids. The park that had always felt like a sanctuary suddenly felt impenetrable. The same trees that made it beautiful made it easy to hide things. Days accumulated, hope thinned in the way it does when searches extend past the point where good outcomes remain likely. A cloud of dread settled over the city. Parents held their children closer. The trails at Point Defiance went quiet. On August 28th, nearly 3 weeks after Jennifer had ridden into the park and not come out, a construction crew working near the park reported a smell. Investigators followed it down a steep embankment into a heavily wooded area just off the main road. Beneath a carefully arranged layer of brush, they found her, Her green Schwinn was hidden nearby. The word that matters in that last sentence is carefully. The brush covering Jennifer's body had not been thrown hastily over her in panic. It had been layered and arranged with deliberate intent, someone who had spent time constructing concealment, who had thought about what came after, who had managed the aftermath of what he had done with enough composure to do it methodically before leaving. The autopsy confirmed she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Among the items recovered from the scene was the swimsuit she had worn when she left home that morning. In August 1986, it was processed as evidence and placed in storage, a piece of clothing that connected Jennifer to her last ordinary hours. No one in 1986 had a reason to believe it was anything more than that. They were wrong, but it would take 27 years before anyone could prove it. 5 months before Jennifer Bastian disappeared, a 12-year-old girl named Michelle Welch had been murdered in another Tacoma park. 2 young girls, 2 public parks, the same city, the same year. For investigators and for the public, the conclusion felt not just logical, it felt inevitable. There was one predator working Tacoma's parks, and finding him meant treating both crimes as one investigation. That decision would cost the case decades. Every suspect had to fit both murders simultaneously. Every lead was filtered through a single killer assumption that narrowed the search in exactly the wrong direction. Resources that could have moved independently toward 2 different men were funneled into one pursuit that went nowhere because the man they were looking for did not exist. There was no serial predator connecting both crimes. There were 2 completely separate killers who had never crossed paths with each other, and the theory designed to catch one of them protected both. One name had floated to the surface early. Robert Dwayne Washburn had lived in Tacoma in 1986. Shortly after Jennifer's disappearance, he called police, not to report something he had witnessed, but to offer a tip about the Michelle Welch investigation. Think about what that call required. He picked up a phone. He dialed the department investigating the murder of a girl in a Tacoma park. He inserted himself into the investigation while the search for Jennifer Bastian was still active. And then, during that same call, he mentioned almost in passing that he was a frequent jogger on the trails near where Jennifer's body would eventually be found. Investigators wrote it down. They had no legal ground to do anything more. He did not fit both cases tightly enough to become a primary focus, so he remained a name in a file, present, noted, and functionally invisible. For 30 years, that call sat in a folder. Nobody yet understood what kind of man makes that call. For Jennifer's mother, Patty Bastian, time did not do what people said it would. It did not soften things. It made the injustice feel sharper, more precise, more present. She later said in court that not a day had gone by in a normal way, that what had been taken from her family was not just Jennifer. It was the ability to experience ordinary days as ordinary. What Patty did with that grief was methodical and quiet. Every year, on Jennifer's birthday and on the anniversary of her disappearance, she called the Detective Bureau. Not to demand, not to confront, just to ask, "Is there anything new? Is there anything I can do?" She became a known presence in the cold case unit, a voice at the other end of the line that reminded everyone working those files why the boxes could not be allowed to simply sit there. The first real answer to Patty's calls came in 2013. Detective Lindsay Wade and her team decided to resubmit the 1986 evidence for analysis, using technology that had not existed when the crime occurred. In November of that year, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab examined Jennifer's swimsuit and successfully extracted a complete male DNA profile. 27 years after the murder, they had the killer's biological fingerprint. They ran it through CODIS, the FBI's national database of DNA collected from convicted offenders. And waited. The search returned nothing. No match. The profile was real, complete, and actionable. The killer simply had no prior felony conviction requiring a DNA sample. He had never been entered into the system, The breakthrough and the dead end arrived in the same moment. The name they needed was still somewhere outside the database, living an ordinary life, completely unaware that his DNA was now sitting in a file with nowhere left to go. Or so he thought. In 2016, the cold case team made a decision that changed everything. They submitted the DNA profile from Jennifer's swimsuit to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based forensic technology company working at the frontier of a technique called investigative genetic genealogy. The method did not require the killer's DNA to already exist in a criminal database. Instead, it used the crime scene profile to search public genealogy platforms, sites like GEDmatch, where ordinary people voluntarily upload their own DNA results to trace family history and find distant relatives. If any biological relative of the unknown suspect had submitted their DNA to one of these platforms, a partial match would surface. Not the suspect himself. A cousin, a second cousin, someone who had no idea they were related to a murderer and no idea they were about to help find him. From those partial matches, genealogists build outward, layering census records, birth certificates, marriage documents, and obituaries against the genetic connections, tracing branches across generations, eliminating every line that cannot converge on the profile until one name becomes the only remaining possibility. The genealogist working Jennifer's case uploaded the swimsuit DNA and waited for the tree to populate. Distant relatives of the killer began appearing. The genealogist traced the connections, followed the branches, cross-referenced the geography. 3 surnames emerged from the family tree as the most likely to belong to the unknown suspect: Smith, Holbrook, and Washburn. Washburn. Investigators pulled their old case files. There he was, Robert Dwayne Washburn. The man who had called in a tip in 1986. The man who had told officers he jogged the trails near where Jennifer's body was found. A name that had been sitting in a file for 30 years, connected to the case by nothing harder than proximity and a phone call he had made himself. Until now, that call had looked like a tip. Standing here, at the end of a genetic family tree that had just pointed directly at him, it looked like something else entirely. By 2017, Robert Dwayne Washburn was 60 years old, living in Eureka, Illinois. His neighbors described someone unremarkable in the most specific way. Quiet, reliable, the kind of man who shoveled the sidewalk for the elderly couple next door, who showed up for every school event for his disabled daughter, who gave no reason to look at him twice. The disconnect between that man and what investigators now suspected was almost architectural in its completeness. As part of a broad reinvestigation push, detectives began re-interviewing everyone connected to the case and requesting voluntary DNA samples for elimination purposes. The request reached Washburn. He agreed. In March 2017, Robert Dwayne Washburn voluntarily submitted his DNA to the police investigation into the murder of Jennifer Bastian. The lab had a significant backlog. Samples were processed in batches. Washburn's ended up in one of the last rounds to be tested. Investigators waited. And on May 7, 2018, 32 years after a 13-year-old girl rode her green Schwinn into Point Defiance Park and did not come home, the result came back. The DNA on Jennifer Bastian's swimsuit matched Robert Dwayne Washburn. The odds of it belonging to anyone else on Earth were 1 in 57 trillion. 3 days later, police arrested him at his home in Eureka, Illinois. His neighbors stood on their front steps and could not make sense of what they were watching. Faced with that number, 1 in 57 trillion. Washburn had no path that did not end in prison. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in January 2019. In a brief written confession, he admitted to grabbing Jennifer as she rode through the park, dragging her into the woods, and killing her. He offered an apology. He gave no explanation for why. He was sentenced to just over 26 years, calculated under Washington's 1986 sentencing guidelines. He is currently incarcerated at the Airway Heights Correction Center in Washington State, where he is expected to spend the rest of his life. The man who thought he had committed the perfect crime had handed his DNA directly to the detectives hunting him. He had done it voluntarily. He had done it out of the confidence that comes from 32 years of believing you have already won. Using the same genetic genealogy technology, investigators simultaneously cracked the Michelle Welch case. Parabon identified 2 brothers as suspects. Detectives followed one of them, a nurse named Gary Hartman, and retrieved his DNA from a napkin he discarded at a restaurant. It matched. 2 murders, 2 separate killers. Both identified through the same technique, in the same city, in the same investigative push. The serial killer theory that had misdirected the investigation for 30 years was not just wrong, its collapse led directly to solving both cases. For Patty Bastian, the woman who had called the Detective Bureau every year for decades just to ask if anything was new, the resolution did not arrive without wait. She stood in a courtroom and looked at the man who had taken her daughter and told him what he had stolen, not just Jennifer, but every ordinary day that came after. The ability to look at a summer afternoon without grief attached to it. Patty did not stop there. She converted her loss into legislation. Her advocacy helped pass Jennifer and Michelle's law in Washington state, a measure that expanded the state's DNA database to require samples from anyone convicted of a felony and from certain misdemeanor offenders whose crimes are known precursors to violent acts. The law closed gaps that had allowed killers like Washburn to move through the system without leaving a biological record. It gave future investigators a better chance, not just at solving murders, but at preventing them. 32 years. A swimsuit in an evidence locker. A stranger who submitted their DNA to a genealogy website to trace their family history and had no idea they were holding the key to a child's murder. Jennifer Bastian went out for a training ride on a summer morning in 1986 and never made it home. The man who took her thought the woods of Point Defiance had swallowed the truth along with her. He was wrong. The truth was on the fabric of the swimsuit she wore that day, microscopic, invisible, patient, and it waited as long as it needed to. Some things cannot stay buried. Not when a mother keeps calling, not when detectives refuse to close the file, not when science keeps moving forward year by year toward answers that once seemed impossible. The green Schwinn is what we remember her by. The girl who was training for a trip with her father, who promised to be home for dinner, who never got the chance to find out what kind of person she was going to become. She deserved to find out.